In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this liquid reveal animation all in After Effects. This was done in collaboration with Pierre Kleinhouse, an amazing designer and illustrator who uses texture, color, and glitch imagery in his work that I absolutely love. He also has a brilliant YouTube channel where he breaks down his process and advice for illustrators as well. Highly underrated. Pierre sent me this file as a PSD with everything beautifully separated into layers and folders. Definitely a great way to make an animator happy. And he also sent me this reference for the animation sequence. Now this helps a lot. I think it's always best to over communicate your idea with someone, and the best way that we can do that is visually. So this is great for me to have. I imported this file straight into After Effects. I color coded some of the compositions and made sure that the head and the skull were both separated into their own pre-comps. And the first thing we're going to animate is the heads and liquid disappearing and revealing using a matte. Let's create a new shape layer by selecting the rectangle tool and just drawing a rectangle over where all of our liquid is going to be. And let's rename that liquid matte because we always label our layers. And then with our rectangle tool still selected, we're going to create a mask. So we want to make sure the tool creates mask is selected and draw a rectangle covering pretty much all of that rectangle except the top area. And we're going to use this to dictate the level of the liquid by changing where the top of this mask sits. So let's move it to exactly the top of our liquid at the start here. Open up our mask path, keyframe that at the start. Let's maybe move that forward to 12 frames. This will be where the liquid's full. And then a bit further on down the line, let's double click this mask and drag the bottom edge until it's completely gone. There. Then a little bit later, let's copy and paste that down keyframe so it stays empty for about half a second. And then about a second later, let's copy and paste that first keyframe where it's full up. If we play that back, we've got our rectangle, which will be our liquid emptying, staying down, and then heading right back up. So let's select all of those keyframes and add an easy ease to them with F9 on our keyboard to make that animation a little bit smoother. And then let's go into the graph editor, select those keyframes, and let's increase the amount of easing just by moving these Bezier handles. So the easing is going to be a bit more severe. There. Let's go back to our timeline view. And now we're going to use this layer to reveal and hide all of our objects. First, let's choose our whiskey back layer. And yes, this liquid is whiskey. It's not formaldehyde or another golden liquid you might be thinking of. It's not. It's absolutely not. It's definitely whiskey. So to our whiskey back layer, let's add the effect set to matte. And let's choose to take the matte from layer liquid matte and make sure we choose effects and masks. As soon as we do that, our whiskey is hidden. And if we hide our liquid matte layer at the top, we can see our whiskey matte layer being depleted, which in this case is wonderful because it comes right back up again. Now, set matte only really works correctly if both layers involved are set to continually rasterize, which you can do by checking this column over here. So make sure that these star-shaped boys are always selected. Otherwise, you'll be sorry. Now we also want our head to get hidden as the whiskey drains. So we can just copy the set matte effect from our whiskey back layer and paste it onto our head. Now both layers get drained, magic. Now for our skull, we want the opposite. We want it only visible when the whiskey is gone. So we can paste that same effect onto our skull layer and then select invert mask. And there we have it, inverted magic. Now this is the foundation for this animation. We've got one matte layer that drives the whole effect. And now I'm going to show you how I added all the details and little bits of polish to bring this to life. I also added on the top of everything an adjustment layer with the posterized time effect set to 12 frames per second. To give this a more traditionally animated frame rate and look, which I don't think I've ever done before on this channel, the next step was to get this water effect happening here, which we do by adding our trusty effect Wave Warp onto our liquid matte layer, which gives us this nice wavy motion at the top. And of course, anything that we do to this matte layer affects the visibility of our whiskey and our heads. And in this pass, I also added the whiskey draining away at the bottom. I did that on our whiskey bottom layer by drawing a mask with our ellipse tool and then shrinking that over a few frames, and then scaling it back up just as our whiskey starts to rise. I also added some keyframes on the opacity property for these two whiskey layers, so they went 100% invisible when they were emptied, just to cover myself if my masks weren't perfect. And I made these hold keyframes by right-clicking and choosing toggle hold keyframes. So the opacity switches from 100% to 0%. There's no fading animation in between. Then I added some animation to the head and the skull with their position and rotation properties. The head bobs around subtly in the liquid and then springs back up when the liquid comes back and the head becomes more buoyant again. And I have the skull falling down and hitting the side of the jar, I also added a little bit of a bounce over one frame so it feels like a really solid, rigid object. The next step was to add this second layer of liquid behind our main whiskey back layer, which I've named Whiskey Back Even Backer because labeling your layers can be fun too. And I made its animation different from our closer whiskey layer by duplicating our liquid matte layer and then moving it up slightly, and then also changing the wave speed on the wave warp from 1 to -1. That way the back layer moves in the opposite direction and gives the illusion that it's circling around the jar. And I added a bit of grain shading in that layer by using a roughen edges effect on a duplicate layer with an orange fill. And you can see the full details of that process in my better animated grain tutorial. Now, the bubbles. I made a new comp with a white stroked ellipse that kind of snakes its way to the top of the comp. I also added some path animation so its shape slightly changes and grows as it gets towards the top. And I also added a wiggle path so there would be just a bit more randomness to its shape as it travels. Now I made two of these comps, one with a slightly different path and a smaller bubble, and put those all together in one big comp of lots of bubbles where I just duplicated them a whole bunch and offset them a fair bit. So we get a few seconds of this constant bubble action happening. I placed that in our main comp and copied the same set matte effect that we used on our first whiskey and the head as well. So the bubbles are only visible when the liquid's there. Now to make these bubbles loop seamlessly, I used my patented split comp technique, which I'll show you. Let's delete this second one. So we've got our main bubbles comp here, and I've got this comp starting while the liquid is drained. So it hides our liquid starting, and then at 5 seconds where our work area ends, where the animation continues back at the start on loops, I'm going to split this layer by pressing Ctrl-Shift-D on my keyboard, and then dragging this back end over to the start. So it picks up from the 5-second mark, right where we left off at the very beginning. Let's trim this back end as well, so that disappears while the whiskey is empty, and now we get a seamless loop. Then I added some subtle animation to the head. I did this all in a separate comp, just containing the head to keep my project nice and clean. I added a slight smirk to the lips, just using the puppet tool, and then did a similar thing with the hair, so there's some slight movement with the puppet pins. And then I animated the eyes blinking. Well, I animated one eye blinking and then flipped that composition. Never do something twice if you can get away with doing it once, but only if you can get away with it. I also animated the two parts of the skull shifting slightly as it fell. I then added a tiny bit of rotation to the tag, which from Pierre's layer name is called a necker, which is very different from the neckers that I'm used to dealing with. So it turns out you can also learn a lot from layer names. And the very last details I added was a turbulent displace to our head comp, so the head looks slightly distorted from the light reflecting in the whiskey. I added this white stroke to the top of our liquid here, just using a duplicate of our matte, and then using another turbulent displace effect, but this time on our whiskey bottom layer. So that way when the liquid drains away, it doesn't do it in a perfect ellipse shape. There's some slight randomness as it shrinks. And we're done. The total time to animate this was about 5 hours, thanks to Pierre's wonderfully set up file. To discover the best ways to learn motion design, I've created a short playlist of videos that I think you'll enjoy if you made it this far. Please like the video and consider subscribing if you'd like more of these videos every week. I'll see you in the next video.